Hi, this is Ken Jarecke, and today we're talking with legendary Time magazine photographer Diana Walker. It's a just a she's a treasure. She's a wealth of knowledge, and I couldn't be more excited to be talking with her today. Hi, Diana.
Hi, Ken. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
There you are in a wonderful part of the world, Montana, where I wish I were at the moment, but I'm not. I'm in Washington, D.C. So, how is it in the mountains of Montana?
Well, it's snowing a little bit right now, and I have to drive into town later today, so that'll be fun.
Good
You
luck.
know, yeah, you know how that goes.
Yes, I do.
So, you can I tell a story? Do you mind if I tell a story about the first time we met?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
Love to hear it.
So I was a young photographer and I was in New York City, and I got an assignment from Time Magazine to shoot the publisher's letter, the photo that goes on the publisher's letter. And I was so excited because it was going to be a picture of you.
Oh,
And do you remember that?
no, no, not at all.
Well,
This
I
is,
was very excited. It was a big moment for me. Okay.
and for me, I would like to be in a pub letter. So that, what happened?
Well, this was I don't remember what the cover story was. It was uh, you were in an apartment in Central Park West, and you were photographing somebody, and I don't remember probably somebody very famous. I don't remember who it was, but I showed up there, and you gave me the sync cord to your lights, and you said, "Okay, here's this. Here stand here, put your aperture at f8, and I'm going to sit here." And you shoot the picture. And so I did exactly what you said. And you're very kind to me. I didn't have to even do anything. But the important thing about it was you were so kind to me, and it was such a big deal to me to meet you, but also to get a day rate from Time Magazine at that point for really doing nothing. I just showed up and pushed the button. But whatever it was, $325, $350 back then, that was enough for a young photographer to survive for 2 weeks in New York City at that point. That was probably like 1985 or something like
Yeah. Well, I wish I remembered it, but
that.
I don't. And I'm sure I was nice to you because had been exactly where uh, you were in that position, uh, going in to photograph someone who worked on a more regular basis for Time at that time. And it was a big deal. To take the pub letter picture. And so, of course, I was going to be nice to you because you were going to be nice to me and take a, a nice picture for the pub letter.
Well,
Was,
I don't know how many covers you shot for Time. You were the White House photographer there for how many years?
well, I shared it. And I shared it I did a little bit of the Carter years and a lot of the Reagan years. I did the Mondale campaign. I did George Herbert Walker Bush. And then I did two terms of Clinton and the Gore campaign. And then I said, listen, I've been at the White House too long. So I'll work for you, but for Time, but let me try my hand at a few other things besides the White House. And um, I think I'd like to do a book or two also. So I'm here. I just don't want to do the White House any longer. And that was in 2001 when George
Okay.
W. Bush took over.
But you've done some work. White Washington kind of work since then. I mean, you spent 30 years, literally 30 years shooting politics.
Yes, I did. And I stayed at Time doing politics um, in the new century in 2000, right through about 2000, 2014, when I realized it was time for me to hang it up. that my knees weren't any good anymore, and I couldn't run, and I couldn't do things like that. So I did a few assignments for them in 2014, and then I said goodbye. And they've been very nice, and have thought about me every so often, and have asked me to go back to do one thing or another, but I just can't do it anymore. So I am fully retired. I've hung it up.
Well, I know you're still working, so you're not going to get away with that. You're, but tell me, for somebody who doesn't know, someone who's never worked in Washington, D.C., when you say you shared the position with another photographer, the White House photographer for Time Magazine, you rotated each month. So you'd go a month on and a month off. Tell
Yeah.
me, right? That was
Yes,
right.
that's what we did. And it was kind of established by Dirk Halstead, who covered it with David Kennerly in the Reagan administration, and I was kind of the third. I was pretty new to Time. I started freelancing for them in during the Carter administration, and so they sent me over to do work when David and Dirk were otherwise occupied, and I did a lot of Nancy Reagan. And then the picture editor at Time, Arnold Rapkin, asked me if I would go out on the Mondale campaign, which was in 1984. And in those days, Time liked to have one photographer attach themselves to a campaign, and by attaching early, breed familiarity. So I was chosen to do Mondale because, number one, I lived across the street from him. So we were familiar to one another. And so I got in early on that campaign. And for 16 months, I covered it. And that certainly did give me a lot of access, and access behind the scenes, when Time would say, we want you on election night to be where nobody else is. We want you to be in the room with the candidate. And that's what they always were aiming for. And that was just sort of a specialty of Times. And in the end, as history tells us, Mondale lost badly. And so I got to go to the White House after that. I guess they figured I'd proven my mettle. And so I went full time with Dirk onto Reagan's White House. And then I stayed for George Herbert Walker Bush's White House. And then there were three of us who covered Clinton, and that was Dirk and Cynthia Johnson and myself, and we did it every third month, which kept us, we thought, fresh. Because if you sit in the White House and stay there all day, it's very hard to concentrate, and it's very hard to be fresh and to look at the White House with a fresh eye. So that's how we kept fresh, at least we felt we did, by being on it for a month at a time. That kept you current with all the powers that be, but it also meant that you got to go off and do any kind of other assignment when you were off, which suited me very well because I had a family and 2 kids and obligations.
So when you spend 16 months with a candidate, and this is just kind of pertinent to what's happening today, you start in Iowa with the caucuses, you go back and forth to New Hampshire sometimes, but when you start with a candidate at that point, it's just you and 2 or 3 staffers, a driver in a van driving around Iowa.
Yes, it is. The Mondale campaign really started for me in a town called Dothan, Alabama. And there were 5 of us, I believe. there was Margaret Warner, who was a writer for Newsweek. There was Bob Abernathy, who was an NBC correspondent. There was, there were 3 or 4 of us who started in a little airplane, a little chartered plane following Fritz Mondale. And there were just the few of us. And we got to know the staff very well over those months. And, you know, the aim was to make us, the Time Magazine team, familiar with Mondale. And Newsweek, I didn't have a photographer, but they had Margaret Warner writing words, and Time didn't have a writer, but they had me taking pictures. And so at least they had one person there from the very beginning. And it does breed familiarity, absolutely. And it's wonderful because you really, honestly, looking back at my career, you've got to do one campaign entirely. And then you really know how the system works in the United States. Now, with talk of Iowa and the caucuses and New Hampshire, I remember so vividly all of that in Iowa. Of course, I've done it many times since. I was on George Bush when he ran for the White House. And then I was not on Clinton. I was on Bush running against Clinton. And then Clinton came to the White House, and I took one look at him and said, who is this guy anyway? And because I had not been out with him, I was not familiar with him. I was very familiar with the White House itself and how it ran. And then, of course, all the Democrats came in. And when the Democrats came in 1992 to work for Clinton, and everybody changed. Out went the Bush people, and in came the Clinton people. And a lot of the Clinton people were the Carter people from back in the late 70s. They were coming around again to the White House. And so, although I didn't know the Clinton people at all, a lot of them were familiar with me because they had been there with Carter and
Sure.
Rosalynn Carter. And they had been either up at Harvard at the Kennedy School, or they had been working at other jobs during the Republican years. And then they were back again in the White House with Clinton.
Sure. I mean, you see those cycles, and the more you do politics, the more people you know in those inner circles. I got my start in Iowa too, as far as political photography goes. And I was a kid, I lived in Omaha, but I could drive to Iowa and I could get access to candidates in the early stages of the campaign. And it's an end of an era if we do lose the Iowa caucuses. That's my point of view. And I think it was a valuable, not only a training ground for young journalists, but like you said, it was a great way to get access further on down the road.
Sure. I remember several people who would just show up freelancing, or they would show up for the New York Times, and they were getting familiar, and so were we. And certainly when push came to shove later in the campaign, when it was really important to see Mondale right before the last debate, or to be there on election night, or to get that kind of thing, we got it. And we got it because they knew who I was. And one of the things that I sort of decided back then was if I was going to ask for exclusive access to a presidential candidate or to a president, that, and I know this is controversial, and I know a lot of people don't agree with my choice, but I made my mind up that I was there, if I got in, I was there as a photographer. I was not there as a reporter. In these cases, I would go in, and the one thing that was on my mind was to take a picture that gave you some idea of the tension or the humor or the lack thereof, or whatever I saw in that room. I was using my eyes, not my ears. And had I been using both, I would have gotten what I heard wrong, because I don't multitask very well. And I would give anybody the wrong idea or the wrong quotation or anything. I never did that. I went in as a photographer, and that stood me in good stead down the line. And some of the people who came in with Clinton said, oh, we know her. We know Diana Walker, and she comes to do a picture essay. She doesn't come to report what she sees. She reports what she sees only in an image. And so that really did help me. I know it did. I've heard it from the other side.
Well, there, you brought up a lot of good points, and I'll just kind of go through them because we do want to kind of help people, young photographers. So number one, when you ask for special access, your magazine has to have your back, or your newspaper. If you ask and get access and then they don't publish it well, then that's the end of that, right?
You know, I had an ideal boss in Time in the 80s. This will give you an idea. Walter Isaacson, whom you know went on from Time to CNN and then to the Aspen Institute, and he's written many, many biographies that we all know, from Steve Jobs to Michelangelo. And he was managing editor of Time in the 90s when Bill Clinton was president. And he said to me, if you get behind the scenes, if you get special access to photograph a president, I'll run it. And I said, you're on. This is great. And so when I asked for it, I came to ask for it with the backing of my magazine and with evidence of what we were after in the form of a letter from Time. And honestly, I can't remember a behind the scenes event that we covered that we didn't run. And Time ran them as picture stories of mine with nothing but simple captions about where the president was and what he was doing and who he was with. We never did I have a writer go in with me. It was exclusive images. And we got some really interesting access when I was all lined up, for instance, to photograph Clinton as he faced his first debate with Bob Dole. And Clinton was practicing at the White House on how to do a debate. And on a Monday morning, I came to the White House knowing that Mike McCurry, the press secretary, had said, yes, I could be behind the scenes in this time before the first debate. And all of a sudden on the radio, they announced that there was going to be a Mideast summit at the White House that day. And it was a total surprise, and nobody knew about it. And I said, oh, damn, there goes my access to the president, showing him preparing for the debate. And I walked into Mike McCurry's office, or the outskirts of his office, where there were lots of journalists clamoring to find out when was this meeting going to happen, and where it was going to happen, and who was coming. And he was saying it's going to be Arafat and Netanyahu and everybody, the Secretary of State, of course, and the Vice President. And I looked at Mike when he was free, and I said, I guess I don't get coverage this week. And he looked at me and he said, no, Diana, a deal is a deal. And you have time today to photograph him practicing. He's just not going to be practicing. So you get whatever you're going to get, and let me just assign you to go around the White House with Callie Schell, the vice president's photographer, and she will get you into all the places that she is going. And so all of a sudden, Time magazine had this terrific exclusive of this meeting between Arafat and Netanyahu and the president. And it was, they rushed us into the Red Room, and here the whole world was outside the room, waiting with bated breath to find out what was going to happen. Was King Hussein going to agree to this, that, and the other? What about Netanyahu? What about Arafat? All of it. And in we went, just the staff photographers for the principals. In we went.
So Diana, you're walking into the Red Room with Callie Schell.
And I don't know what we're going to see in front of us. And all of a sudden, there was this love seat in the middle of the room, and there sitting on the love seat sat Arafat and Netanyahu talking together. And here everybody in the world was wondering where they were and what they were doing in the White House. And I had it for Time magazine. And we were the only periodical, and there were no newspapers, there was nobody in this room. So we quickly took some images of them sitting in the chair, and then went on and hovered near the door into the East Room. And we hovered there, and in came Clinton and Gore and King Hussein. And this, it was like choreography. They all would change who was sitting where and who was doing what and who was talking to whom. And we were able to photograph those people as best we could, with just the official photographers from the king and from Netanyahu and from Arafat's team. And it was fabulous. And it was one of those marvelous things that sometimes happen. And you just find yourself with something extremely exclusive and exciting.
Tell me how, at that time, how important was an exclusive like that to Time magazine or Newsweek?
It was very important to Time magazine. I remember when I went to work in the campaign of 1984, and my colleagues who had been at the magazine much longer than I said, don't think they're not going to call in their chips one day, and they're going to call you up and they're going to expect you, because they've assigned you for so long to one team, they are going to expect you to deliver exclusive events for Time magazine. And indeed they did. And indeed I had a pretty good record of coming up with things that that were very exclusive. And also, we never, I don't think, as far as I was concerned, we never overused the opportunities we were afforded. We asked when we really wanted it, and we presented ourselves well. We were discreet. We were we we were honorable. we were who we said we were, and I had a wonderful set of editors in New York whom I always knew were not out in any way to embarrass the presidency or the things that I was photographing. They were after the best pictures, and they would always represent me in the best way. I always thought that they were really responsible for my success because they edited my work very well, and they were very sympathetic, and they were very helpful, and you know, they were the best kind of editors you could get.
Well, yeah, it's always great to credit the editors because it is a team effort, this whole photojournalism thing.
Yeah.
You know, it after Walter Cronkite died, I remember one of his daughters or family members saying something like, "We never knew his politics. He never shared who he voted for with us. He was a journalist." And as I'm talking to you, I mean, we know each other. We're friends. We talk about everything, right? But nobody in Washington D.C. would ever know Diana Walker's politics, I don't think.
I hope not. Oh no, for years, my politics were totally unimportant. And as a contract photographer, it wasn't, Time had a bunch of contract photographers, and that meant that we really were working for ourselves, but Time had a first look at all of our images. And I I didn't have to abide by this, but I did anyway. It's like sort of taking the extra mile. I decided, sure, I'm freelance. I'm on contract, which means I'm really freelance. And I could say who I was going to vote for. I didn't have to keep it to myself, but I felt that it was important to be impartial, and impartial to how I covered each president. Each president I looked at as a human being, as someone whose character I was after, whose character I wanted to find, if I could, with access or without access. Even if I was just in the pack and shooting a long lens from the bleachers, I had to somehow find a moment or a movement that somehow said, this is who I am. This is a clue to who George Herbert Walker Bush was, or who Bill Clinton was. You got these clues, and you showed what you could of the human being, and that's what was important, not my preference or political preference, which was nobody's business. Nor should it be my business to show you. I was there to show you a human being who was in fact extremely important to the country, because one of these two characters was going to be the next president.
So it's so telling to me. It's so important and just worth noting. We always go back to this. I talk to photojournalists all the time, and the good ones always talk about empathy, making that connection. And even when you're dealing with the most powerful person in the world, that's still your job as a photojournalist.
Yes, that's kind of what you're after, because you know certainly that what Newsweek shoots and what US News would shoot and what an agency would shoot and what I would shoot or what Dirk would shoot or whoever was on the White House at that moment. We all are basically, if we don't have special access, we're all in a group of people. And we always try and move out of the pool and get some different angle. And what I remember, John Derniak, who was the picture editor when I first came to Time, and he said, he scared me to death because he was so forceful and so excited and so, well, he was just a force. And I remember him saying, now listen, this is what I want you to do. He said, you know this picture of Khrushchev and Nixon? You see this picture? And I looked, and it was the two, Nixon and Khrushchev, yammering at each other somewhere, I think it was in Russia. And then he said, now look at this picture. And he said, this is another picture that Dirk took for me. And he said, look, he went up the stairs, up to the balcony, and he shot from on top of the balcony right down on the head of Nixon and Khrushchev. And he said, this is great. This is what I want. I want the view that the wires get, the straight on view of what's going on, the accurate event, but I want your view too. I want you running up the stairs and shooting it from above like Dirk did. And he held this up to me in the late 70s as saying, this is what we want. We want you to think and you to operate. We want to see this event through your eye, and you have to have several different pairs of eyes. Not easy.
No, it's a stressful job. I mean, the White House, because the one moment when the hand goes in a certain way, that turns out to be the moment. And you've seen it so many times. We worked on a weekly schedule, and the picture of the week that everybody wanted, everybody needed, happened in a split second. That was gone between the time you were making the standard wire shot and the time you were trying to make your shot.
That's right. And I can remember very well making an image and then trying for the second shot, and not having time to get there. I can remember missing the what they used to call the money shot. Yeah. And I remember being in the motorcades, and just like you remember the motorcades when you were out for US News. And I would get back in the motorcade after we'd shot a picture, and I remember I'd hear Larry Downing, or I'd hear Chick Harrity, or I'd hear one of the other photographers in the pool with me saying, oh, well, that sure was the picture when Reagan looked up for the flyover, and that certainly was it. And I'd think to myself, oh dear, that's not the picture I got. And we used to have to send our images in the night they occurred, and they would be looked at the next day. But also what was looked at by our editors the next day were the wire pictures that had been taken by AP, UPI, Reuters, Agence France-Presse, and they were on everybody's desk. And finally, at the end of the week, our pictures would come up, and you were scared to death. But by that time, they were so used to that wire picture that they liked from Tuesday that they would use that instead of your picture the next week in the magazine. And we all used to live in fear that a wire picture would appear instead of one of ours, and that would mean that we had really blown it. And that's frightening to the photographer out there.
Well, tell me about that. It's huge competition. There's like anywhere between 8 and 12 photographers in the photo pool at any given time. And you're all riding around in the same van. And there's competition there. There's also camaraderie. I mean, if somebody trips, somebody breaks a piece of equipment, other people are going to like help them out with a piece of gear or help them up when they trip, whatever, you know. But there's that competition. It is kind of like a locker room, that talking smack back and forth, like athletes would do. And so, I mean, you were always above that. I know that, but what was? Just tell me about that atmosphere that you experienced in, you know, in the van with the boys.
In the van with the boys. You know, it was interesting, back in the late 70s and the early 80s. And I know this is hard for people today to understand, but there weren't that many women doing the kind of work that I was doing, except Newsweek had a woman when I first came. I first started freelancing for Time in the late 70s. The New York Times had a woman, and the Washington Post had in and out a woman. And it surprised me to see how many women there were. And I think we had to prove ourselves a little bit more than had we been men. And I believed ever since the late 70s and the early 80s that women in the kind of work I was doing, covering the White House, I'll be that specific, covering the White House was really easy in a way. And that was because we worked as individuals, but we also worked as people who covered the White House every day. We knew each other well. We weren't about to go shove each other out of the way. And we knew to get down out of the television's way because they were on sticks, on tripods, and we were mobile. And the writers knew to step back because they had notebooks. They didn't need unrestricted views. And always, if I ran late and missed getting a decent position, one of my colleagues would say, "Here, Diana, come over here." And I remember television cameras doing that too. And I remember coming late to see Jimmy Carter at the National Cathedral the morning that the members of the staff at the embassy in Iraq were taken prisoner. And
Iran. Iran.
Yeah, oh, excuse me, Iran, of course, Iran. And they were taken prisoner there for lots of different reasons. And President Carter went with Cy Vance and his vice president, Fritz Mondale, to the National Cathedral to pray for those hostages. And this was an important picture because it told you a lot about who Jimmy Carter was and just how serious an event this was. And I came late to it. And don't ask me how that happened, but it did. And I was lucky to get there in time. And when I came in, I looked around and there was no place for me. And one of the NBC cameramen turned to me and he said, "Quick, get under my tripod." And I got down on my knees right underneath the tripod that was 6 feet from Jimmy Carter's face. And that's what I mean about the kind of camaraderie there was and the kind of help there was. But boy, let me tell you, when you were in Tokyo, Japan, and you were on your way in to see the meeting between President George Herbert Walker Bush and the Emperor of Japan, you had to run, and you had to run fast. And we learned that in a country like Japan, we would carry ladders when we went, because that was the only way we were going to see the event, because the Japanese used to let the Japanese press corps in first, and we couldn't get a view of the event, and we'd have to climb up our ladders. And I remember my two colleagues, Dirk Halstead and David Kennerly, went off and bought me a pink ladder, and I used it for years in the White House. But that's the kind of camaraderie there was. But you still had to get there, and you had to get there fast, and you had to run. And later in my career, my knees began not to work very well for running, and that's why I retired.
No, there's that camaraderie, but everybody in the room has they have the chops to be there. They have the know-how, they have the talent, they have the ability to be there. And that group, it becomes, like you said, a machine, a choreographed machine where it works, and somehow 30 people can go into the Oval Office and go out of the Oval Office, and usually a lamp doesn't get tipped over, or
You hope it doesn't. Right. Well, that reminds me of a story, but I can remember so many times there was a protocol about going into the Oval Office for an Oval Office meeting between a president and a head of state, for instance. There first would be the wire services, with AP being the first, and UPI, as long as that was there, and Agence France Presse, Reuters, they went first, and they lined up first. And we all were lined up 15 minutes before an event, or a half an hour before an event. And we lined up in order as to our special sort of deal, how we in the White House did it. The wire service, who served the most number of periodicals and newspapers, went first. Then went the news magazines, from the Time, US News, and Newsweek. And then the daily newspapers like the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune and the Washington Post, of course, and then agencies who sent their representatives like Sigma or Black Star into photo ops all the time. And then there would be other photographers too, who were accredited to the White House and who had access. And boy, I had to hold my spot. I mean, we all went in as fast as we could, got as low as we could, and took as many pictures, or as meaningful a picture as you possibly can, in a scrum like that, where you've got all these photographers on the floor of the Oval Office, and then all of these television cameras, and then the writers. And it was amazing. And it was overwhelming for the foreign visitor to see these people rushing at them. But we always got down, and we always sort of took our place in this choreographed entrance and exit of the White House. And then someone like Mark Weinberg, who worked for the press office for Reagan, would say, "Thank you very much. Thank you, press. Press, you heard me. Thank you. It's time to get up and leave." And we would all jump up and take a few pictures as we were leaving, of Colin Powell whispering to some congressman who was in the room, or a secretary of defense, or whatever. We were always trying to look for those kinds of pictures too, that your boss didn't expect, but they'd fill a hole one day. So it was—
Well, this whole thing would, I mean, depending on what Mark had for breakfast that day, it might last 30 seconds, it might last 2 minutes, but it was short.
It was very short. And it was, I have to say, it was hard for me when I first came to the White House, because I didn't come from a small newspaper somewhere or a magazine, or I was really untrained. And I was this strange um, freelancer for Time magazine who was coming in and taking pictures. And so the good part for me, what made it easier, I think, than harder, is that when I came in, you could see if I could do it or if I couldn't do it by what was in the newspaper on Monday, the magazine on Monday. We closed Friday night. I'd been in these pools or this generalist gaggle of press. I'd been everywhere where the president had been that week. And the question was, is she any good? What you could, I was lucky enough to be working for a weekly magazine that it was there, whether it was good or wasn't good. It was in the magazine usually, unless they used a wire picture.
Well, no, you're being too hard on yourself, because you 99% of the time you were in the magazine that week. And the interesting that, when you brought up the newspapers, and the newspapers are shooting for one day, but as a news weekly photographer, you had the opportunity to build this body of work throughout the week, and really kind of by the end of the week, you had a picture that kind of summed up that week. That was your goal. It wasn't the daily picture, it was the weekly picture.
Yeah,
And that takes insight, because you're not just reacting all the time. You're thinking about what I can get in the rose garden at this event that has nothing to do with anything, but what can
yeah,
I do?
right. Where is there a view of something going on here, which is really interesting? And Time used to love that because they loved a different view. But I'll tell you, for how to screw up, I was in the East Room once for an event with the president and Mrs. Reagan and Vladimir Horowitz, a great pianist. And he was about to go back to Moscow for the first time in his life to play a concert. And it was extremely exciting because he had fled Russia, and he was on his way back for the first time in 50 years. And I had known Horowitz a little bit in that I'd done a take for Time of him for several days in New York to do with this going back to Moscow. And I remember I was up on the riser in the back of the East Building. Excuse me, in the back of the East Room at the White House. And I had photographed Mrs. Reagan sitting next to Horowitz, many times while this event was going on. And I thought, I've done plenty of them. I think I'll come tight on the president, because I don't have any interesting headshots of him from this week. And so I leaned over and got my monopod attached to my 600, and I started shooting pictures of Reagan really close up, when all of a sudden there was a gasp in the East Room. And I quickly looked up, and Mrs. Reagan's chair had been too close to the edge of the riser, and it had flipped over backwards.
Oh, you're right.
Reagan in legs going up in the air. And I had entirely missed the picture because I was tight on Reagan, and this was not a tight picture. This was, you would have been shooting probably Reagan and Horowitz and Mrs. Reagan over on the right, and you would have been able to single them out as they went backwards from the side. And I can't tell you, it was like, you're there to take the picture of what happened there. And you have a headshot of Reagan from that event. You know, sometimes you learn hard how to miss a picture.
Well, you didn't miss too many of them. I mean, speaking of protocol and screwing up, you probably don't remember this either, but the first time I went to the Oval Office, it was Reagan's Oval Office, and which was a very, um, it was a, speaking of protocol, that was a very formal Oval Office. It wasn't a place to mess around. And I was wearing ripped jeans, and you were not amused.
It was me who was not amused.
Yes, you were not amused.
Oh, how awful. And
No,
you stayed
you're
there.
always kind to everybody, but you let me know that you should have unripped jeans when you go to the Oval Office.
That was, that was, I remember Mrs. Bush, who had a very tart tongue. And I remember seeing her over in the old executive office building. We were waiting, a small pool was waiting to do a picture of, in the old EOB of something, I don't know what it was. And Mrs. Bush came along and she looked at all of us, and it was very cold outside. And I remember I had a jacket that I was very proud of. I thought it was extremely good looking. And I was wearing it, hoping I wouldn't rip it. And I was standing there, and Mrs. Bush came and she looked at us. And I guess we had just come from the outside. Of course, we had, from coming over from the White House to the old executive office building, and we were cold and we had our coats on. And I remember Mrs. Bush said, "Oh, look at all of you dressed up in your terrible looking coats." She said, she looked at me and she said, "Oh, you, Diana Walker, you look like Nanook of the North."
Oh dear.
And I, I was so dumbstruck. And I said, "If you only knew how much it cost me to look like Nanook of the North." And we all laughed and we all screamed, and Mrs. Bush laughed heartily. And so we all, we all had funny times and funny things happen to us, all of our sort of merry band of shooters. It was a merry time.
Yeah, that was she was a character. She was wonderful to be around. She'd tell you exactly what she thought at any point. So
Yes, she would. She was funny. I went to photograph her for a book. She and the president, and asked them about what was going on in these pictures for the book I did called Public and Private. And I told her that story, and she said, "You know, people tell me that I would say these things that were really quite rude." And she said, "You know, I honestly don't remember being so tart. And but I guess it's true." And I said gently, "Yes, it is true."
she
So
she made the mistake one day of walking back to the back of the plane. This was in '88, and we were thinking we were clever. For some reason, we taped all our hotel. This is when hotel rooms still had keys, and we taped all our keys to the wall of the airplane so they jingle when we took off. And so we had hundreds of keys taped up to the. And she was so upset. She insisted that we mail all those keys back to the hotels. You know, you could drop them in a mailbox, and we did. So
I missed that, Ken. That must have been a month I was off.
she was not amused. So
No,
can we look at some pictures here?
sure.
I'm just excited to see what you sent. I'm
Well,
going to put them up on the screen. You should be able to see them.
oh yeah.
Whoops, I just screwed up. It's one of those days. Here. Okay. Can you see that okay?
Yes, I see it vividly.
So
It's funny.
the Bushes love their pets. They love the outdoors, and this is just a wonderful image of that it kind of points to what you're talking about, finding that personality that we can connect to and see who these people are.
Well, I was given access to George Bush for a day behind the scenes way back when he first became president. And I'd been inside the Oval Office all day, and I really thought it was time to give the president a breather and not have this time photographer hanging on his every gesture or every move. And so I went outside to get some air myself, and all of a sudden I saw Mrs. Bush and the puppies, and she was trying to get them all together. And so I said, "Oh, this is wonderful." And I went over and sort of looked at her as if to say, "This is okay, isn't it?" And so she, of course, said, "Sure." And she picked up the puppies and tried to get them all together and turned to these two White House butlers whom they called ushers. And this was really a funny scene. There she was, picking them all up, collecting them in her arms, and putting them in a basket. And I showed her this picture when I went to see the Bushes before I published. So when I showed her that picture, when I went down to Texas to interview the president and Mrs. Bush after they left the White House, when I showed Mrs. Bush these pictures, she looked at this picture and she said, "Honestly, Diana, if I'd known you were going to take my picture, I would have changed my shoes."
I love those shoes. That's the best part of the picture. I mean, it's such a gift, this picture. Just, like you just happened upon it.
Yeah, I happened upon it. And, that was the beauty of behind the scenes. It was always a toss-up. You never knew what you were going to see. Like this picture of, I was with Madeleine Albright doing behind the scenes series of images of her for a cover story that week. And she went over to the Reagan building for the meeting of NATO, and the meeting, NATO was meeting in Washington, and I went with Mrs. Albright, and she and I had driven carpool together when our children were young. So she was not averse to having me as her shadow, and she said, "Come on in, it's all right, it's just the president." So I went in the room, and the president said, "Madeleine, here, come and sit down next to me." And then Secretary Cohen of the Defense Department, who's on the left as you look at this picture, came in, and President Clinton said, "Here, I can't remember, Bill Cohen. Bill, come on over here and sit with me." And then all of a sudden in came Sandy Berger, who was the, what do you call him, the National Security Advisor. And he sat down on the other end, and President, I was down on my knees right in front of the table with the 35 millimeter lens, no flash, because I never wanted to use a flash and be distracting when I was behind the scenes. It was all available light, and it was all black and white, and it was all to say to our reader, this is exclusive. So you're looking at something special. So there I was focusing, and the president said, "We must look like those monkeys. You know who I mean." And they all did it. They all did, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. And and Berger said, "And I'm evil." And it was just one of the funniest things to happen.
I mean, it's such a playful moment to have these powerful people just.
It is such a playful moment. And the secretary, the press secretary, Joe Lockhart, heard what happened when I was in the room, and he knew I had this picture. And he knew that the tensions going on over NATO and over all of that was much too serious for a picture like this to run. And he was panicked that this was going to be in the magazine. And he called me in at the office, and he said, Diana, it's about this picture you took. And I said, oh yeah, it's very funny. And he said, you wouldn't be using that this week. And I said, I can't imagine we will. Joe, it's not the focus of this week. And I'll tell you, when the contest of the White House News Photographers contest is called the end of this year, I'll be submitting this picture for the contest, but I can practically assure you that it's not going to run in the magazine this week. It's just not appropriate, which of course it wasn't, and we put it aside, and of course it won. It's a real exclusive picture.
No, it's amazing. I miss that kind of moment. This is another great moment. This is, boy, it looks like a debate or something. I'm not sure what's going on.
What's going on is really interesting. This is a picture of Bill Clinton behind the scenes at the convention. In Chicago in 1996. He's running for his second term. He hasn't been introduced yet. They're showing a film about him out front. He's backstage, and you can see he's there with Mark Penn, who's just behind him, and you can see Leon Panetta there, and you can see probably more than I can of who's behind him. And here I am 5 feet away from him, and there's absolutely no light backstage. I mean, none. And I'm holding tight, so tight to my camera. And in those days, there was no digital playback. I was shooting film, and I didn't know if I had enough light or not. I was using my Leicas, and I just held tight as I could, and went as slow as I could on my shutter speed, but I didn't want to have his movement in the picture. And I shot a couple of pictures, and then the music came to a crescendo, the lights came up, the audience stood up and started screaming, and there was Bill Clinton right in front of me for a split second, and he took this huge, deep breath as he walked out onto the stage. I had no idea he'd taken a deep breath. And I remember Michelle Stevenson, my editor, saying, Diana, there is this amazing picture when the president takes a deep breath. Can you imagine him needing to take a deep breath before he went out to this huge, adoring audience to make an extremely important speech? I was so surprised when I saw the picture printed in the magazine Double Truck the next week, because indeed it was in focus and there wasn't any motion, and he was taking this deep, deep breath. That won a first prize too, and he said, Diana, you'll understand if I tell you this isn't my favorite picture myself. Yeah. I said, yes, sir, I understand. And he said, let's do a deep breath for the photographers. So the two of us in the Oval Office in front of the White House photographer, we both took this huge deep breath, and it's one of my favorite pictures, one of my treasures that I have hidden away of President Clinton showing his sense of humor.
No, it's amazing. It's all these images. The common theme is you are capturing that, what your stated goal of putting a human face on these larger than life personalities.
Yeah, yeah. This picture was really an exclusive that it this was only three, let's see, 2 months after the 1981 inaugural of Ronald Reagan. And you can see Jim Brady, who was so grievously wounded in the assassination attempt on the president. You can see Jim in the background next to Dave Gergen. It was that early.
Oh yeah, Dave was writing speeches back at that point.
Yeah,
Jesus.
he was.
Yeah.
And I was working for Time quite a lot over at the White House, but not exclusively. And I wasn't on contract to Time at that. Yes, I was. I'd had a contract with Time since the end of the 70s. But on this particular day, I was working for CBS. And I knew the bureau chief of CBS very, very well. His name was Sandy Sokolow, and he was a prince of a guy. And he called me up and he said, "This is Walter Cronkite's last interview with a sitting president. And I wonder if you would photograph it for us, because we can't have the noise of a bunch of cameras in there. And would you photograph it for us and then give the film to the AP and they will put it out for us?" And so I said, of course I would. I'd love to do that. So I was on the floor taking the pictures, which were really quite dull. They just were of two well-known people talking to each other. It was nothing special, but it was the moment. And so I handed it off to Bud Benjamin, who's a gentleman in the foreground who was a vice president of CBS. And so I was fixing my camera bag, and someone had told me years ago, always keep one roll in your camera. Don't give away all the film at once. Save something, just in case. So dutifully, I'd saved my Leica with some color negative film in it and a flash attachment, a bounce flash attachment. And I had that in front of me, and all of a sudden Bud Benjamin came running back into the Oval Office, and I was down on the floor with all my gear, and he said, quick, Diana, come quick, bring your camera." So I left my bag and I took my 35 millimeter Leica, and in I went. And the president's photographer, Keitlinger, who was a very, very nice guy, was in there, and he knew he'd taken enough pictures. So he kind of backed away and said, "Here, Diana, have at it." And I stood there, and I don't know how many frames I took, not very many, because I was using a flash and I had to wait for the flash to recycle. And there they were, and they were telling jokes. And I have absolutely no idea what they were saying. I told you earlier, I can't hear when I take pictures, and I'm very unreliable. And I have been asked so many times if I know the joke and who told it, and I don't. But I'll tell you who knows. My archives have gone down to the University of Texas, and so have Walter Cronkite's. And Tom Carlton, who runs the Briscoe Center for American History, when I went down there to talk to him about taking my archives, I walked in his office and he said, "I bet you I'm the only person on this earth who knows who told the joke and what it was." And I said, "Yeah, and I bet it was off color as it could be." And he said, "I'm not telling." And I've asked all of the people if they remember, and they all pretend they don't.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
That's so funny. What a great moment.
Yeah, it was a great moment.
Boy, they all look so young there.
Oh, they were. That was inauguration night, 1996, when he won the presidency for the second time.
Nice. I'm going to start clicking through here a little fast. We mentioned
Well,
Walter Isaacson's biography of
yes, and he very kindly used a great many pictures of mine in his biography of Steve Jobs, because of course I had shot it for him from the start. We were behind the scenes doing a special on Steve Jobs, who I'd gotten to know thanks to time, and who let me come always when he was about to do something exciting. And I'd come with my Leicas and black and white film, and this was the first time I ever photographed him. And I just thought it was funny to see Steve so informal with no shoes on.
yeah, yeah.
Not exactly who you think of him as, but that was the first time I'd ever seen him.
Oh, that's his kitchen, I guess, or
It's his kitchen, yes, in a
yeah.
house he never lived in, but he he owned it. And well, later, because of the access, Steve afforded me actually. In 1998, we were behind the scenes with him when he announced that Microsoft, or that Bill Gates
Bill Gates. Yeah.
had given Apple an infusion of 100 million that kept Apple from going bankrupt. It was a huge announcement, and it was so great. I was the only journalist within, I don't know, miles of him the night that he and Bill Gates signed the deal. And I had no idea who he was talking to. I had no idea of any of it. And the next day, when this was announced, I ran to his assistant and said, was he talking to Bill Gates last night? He said he sure was. That signed the deal. That saved Apple. And
Yeah.
I'm calling New York and said, quick, Michelle, tell Walter, we really have a coup. We really have an exclusive here.
That's amazing.
And he changed the cover that day, that Thursday, and we did a black and white cover of Steve Jobs. This
is later, much later.
Yes, it is. And this is a picture of Steve in his office at home in Palo Alto. And the reason this ran in time, I heard, was that the editors were absolutely fascinated that as sort of pristine as his look was, and certainly the look of Apple was, this to them was so funny that he should have a computer that looked like all of theirs with a mess of wires, and that he lived in such chaos. It was just so different from what they expected.
But you recognize that as you're making the pictures, you made a choice to show all that sloppiness.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This is a famous picture.
Yeah.
My daughter has a print of this one.
Don't tell them why. It didn't sell.
Well,
This is I guess, the most reproduced picture of mine that I have. This is a picture that was taken in California when Queen Elizabeth accepted an invitation from the Reagans to come visit California. And I was assigned to the Queen. And so there was a state dinner that was given by the Reagans at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco in her honor, just as though it was a state dinner in Washington at the White House. It was at this museum. And I didn't have much of a long lens. I had a 300, and that was about it. And I was way in the back with all the other photographers. And I remember breaking my monopod, and
Oh, right.
I thought, oh my gosh, this is. So I turned to anybody I could see, to the photographers waiting there, and I said, God, does anybody have a free monopod I can borrow? Does anybody have one? And this guy from the San Francisco Examiner said, I do, and I'm not using it here. So I took it and I put it on my camera, and guess what I did? I broke it.
Oh dear.
God. So I broke the loader, and I just couldn't believe it. And I was bent over looking through this lens sideways, trying to focus on this picture, not knowing what the light was. I hadn't been down and taken a reading. I was shooting tungsten film. This was not auspicious, but on the way to the Young Museum, our writer, Larry Barrett, had a copy of the Queen's remarks that she was going to give. And I guess this goes to show that if you have access to any information on what's going to happen at the event, it's a good idea to read it. And I read it, and the Queen had a laugh line. And the laugh line was, it had poured rain on this trip. I mean, rain, you couldn't believe it. And she was supposed to come up the coast on her yacht, and they had to cancel that because it was so rainy and so horrible. And so the Queen said, I knew, President Reagan, that when the Puritans came to the New World, that they brought with them many of our customs, but I had no idea they brought the rotten weather too. The president just threw his head back, and I was waiting. I am sure everybody else was tired of shooting the picture because this was
right.
And so I was lucky enough to get just the right second. Really, it just worked, and it became a pretty famous picture, and it's been used in memes and
Right.
Billboards and all kinds of stuff all over.
What a wonderful story and a wonderful lesson for a photojournalist to. Here's Steve again, Jobs.
There's Steve, the night I was alone with him when he took the call from Bill Gates.
Wow.
That's it.
That's nice. Oh, here's the love seat, right? Yeah.
There's a love seat picture about and Netanyahu.
That's a nice frame, Diana. That's a keeper. Wow.
Yeah, that's a translator behind them.
Wow.
No.
It's beautiful. Oh, this is a pretty famous one here too. They're watching the returns, I guess, huh? What are they watching?
Not the returns. They are at the convention in Houston, Texas, the year Bush ran for re-election, 1992, against Bill Clinton. And he's waiting for his turn to go out to make his acceptance speech of the nomination. And he was sitting in this off the stage holding room, they would call it. And they went as far in holding rooms to make the president feel at ease by having photographs brought up from the White House.
Right.
Events going on.
It's amazing.
It is amazing. So those large pictures, and then you can see the conventioneers listening to Bush's name being put in nomination, and then the rather heavy-set man closest to the television is Roger Ailes, who became very famous later, and not for the best reasons in the world. And he was an advisor, an informal, hired advisor of George Herbert Walker Bush and his reelection. And he's sitting next to Craig Fuller, who was also an aide to President Bush. And you know, you go into the room like this, and I knew I didn't have what you call a lead picture. That meant the picture that was going to open this section of nothing but black and white pictures behind the scenes. And you had P.F. Bentley working for Time, photographing Clinton and getting everything behind the scenes with
Right.
Clinton. And I was forced to try and do the same with George Herbert Walker Bush, who was an extremely charming and extremely nice man. But his behind the scenes was a little bit more formal because, you know, I don't think he was quite as open to photography as Clinton was then and continued to be during his years at the White House.
Right.
So I
And so
wondered,
you're
oh, what am I going to get here?
right.
And I
So
went,
sorry, go ahead.
not at
I
all.
cut you off.
So I go in as you know, having an exclusive opportunity to see him before he went on stage that night. And luckily, while I was sitting, or not sitting, sort of down on my haunches, they had been talking about where everybody was sitting in the convention, and that's that large card on the table. It showed the president, who he was going to see in the audience right in front of him, so that he'd be able to refer to them or look at them or wave at them or whatever. It just helped the president get his bearings. And Roger Ailes starts to tell a joke. Here we go again with jokes. And all of a sudden, the president just really let himself go. And he stretched out and he laughed and he thought whatever it was that Ailes has said, funniest thing I've ever heard. And I thought, bingo, I've got my lead. And
No,
indeed,
you're building this essay through the week, and you don't know what you're going to get. And you, like you said, you needed an anchor to build this a foundation for this whole essay, and this nailed it. I mean, it's just, and Roger Ailes, I'm sure Roger Ailes just said, "Mr. President, I'm going to create my own TV network and put CNN out of business."
ho, ho, ho.
This is an amazing picture. This is one for the ages.
Yeah, I was with Clinton for the last 3 or 4 days of his presidency,
Right.
As was P.F. Bentley for Newsweek. And I was working, of course, for Time. And we got out to Andrews Air Force Base, where the plane was waiting for President Clinton and his family to take them up to New York to say, you know, this was the farewell ceremony at Andrews, which was forced to be indoors because the weather was bad. And the president got out of the back of his car to go inside for this event. And I shot this picture, and to me, it said it all about a man who had lived through being impeached as president and who was leaving after two administrations of his. And it was a hard day for him. And it was a hard day also because of the fact that George W. Bush was the new president and Gore had lost. And I think a lot of things must have been going through Clinton's mind that day. And to me, this was the ender of indeed my book that included his presidency. This said it all, it seemed to me. I think that was a very lucky shot.
Well, it was lucky, but you worked 8 years to put yourself in position to make that shot. So I'm not sure how lucky it actually is.
It's funny, one doesn't think of it, but that's right. I had worked 8 years to get it, and they wanted me right there.
That's
And
it's amazing. It's amazing. It's really it reminds me of those, when you see the picture of the president when he takes the office and when he leaves the office, and you see that the lines in their face and the age and the weariness and all this weight of the office. This is the weight of the office. That's 8 years of that.
that's right. Oh,
This is
I
later. Yeah.
sure. This is so funny because I must tell you that covering George Herbert Walker Bush's campaign, he was running for a second term as president, and he was running against this sort of upstart from Arkansas. They may have shared Yale, but that's about all either thought the other shared with either one of them. And George W. Bush thought he had this idea that he would put his father, George Bush, and Clinton, these two former presidents, he would put them together to form a committee to get the colleges and schools of New Orleans back on their feet after the devastating floods of the hurricane. And this is a picture behind the scenes again, where Time had the opportunity to be in the room just before these two gentlemen talked to Michael Duffy, the correspondent, about what they had learned about each other and how well they'd gotten on, working together for the University of, well, for everything in New Orleans. And George Herbert Walker Bush, I think his impressions of President Clinton were so improved when they got to know each other. And they indeed, you could tell, and I think you can tell from this picture, I hope you can, that they got on really well. And so I waited as Duffy began to talk to them and got them talking for the moment when Bush put his hand on Clinton's shoulder. That was what said to me, these guys are buddies. And look at them, they're telling fishing stories together. And so it was really fun to photograph them that day. They who were suspect of each other and really didn't have much respect for each other in the campaign turned out to, well, as you probably know, George Herbert Walker Bush would invite Clinton to come up for the weekend up to New Hampshire. He asked him a couple of times to come. I don't know how Barbara Bush liked it, but certainly President Bush loved it, and they got along famously.
Now you can tell it's a true moment. It's not they're not posing for the camera. This is a real moment.
Yeah. I put this up because this is actually the first picture, one of the first pictures I ever had printed in Time. It was a trip that Rosalind Carter took. I don't know if most of your audience probably, it wasn't alive when this happened, but Mrs. Carter traveled for President Carter during the time, as I alluded to before, of in Iran, when the Iranians captured the American embassy and kept 50 Foreign Service officers hostage for 420 some days of the last days of his administration. He vowed not to leave the White House until he got those people out of there. and he was trying feverishly for a deal and with the Iranians. And Mrs. Carter did all of his sort of jobs. And one of them was to go see the refugees in Thailand who were coming across the border from Cambodia, where they were being slaughtered by the Khmer Rouge, which was the opposition party in Cambodia. And this was a tough scene. It was certainly the hardest thing I'd have ever photographed in my life. And it was so jammed with press, and there were open trenches and the dying refugees underfoot. And it was just an amazing, I would call it a gangbang, that's what we used to say. And Mrs. Carter is holding a baby in her arms who actually died about 5 minutes later. And it was so moving to Mrs. Carter that I know she was unbelievably touched by all of this and how grotesque it was. And she had great empathy for people. And I never saw her carry out her duties as First Lady without the utmost grace. She was really a thoughtful and interested First Lady.
Now you can see that this situation started out as one thing, maybe a press avail, and then it turned into something else really quickly, and it was another real moment. It wasn't, this is who she is, this is who this situation is.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of a famous picture.
Yeah, this is my last trip. This is my last trip for Time magazine, and little did I know what I was going to get when I got on the airplane. Time asked me if I would go on Mrs. Clinton's trip as Secretary of State to a secret place. They wouldn't tell the press where she was going, but they said it was important. And indeed it was important. And we found out where we were going about halfway through the trip over to Italy. What Mrs. Clinton was Secretary of State under Obama. And she went on a trip that started in Malta, where this picture was taken. And this is what you call a C-17. And that was a military transport plane. I mean, it really is peculiar looking, but it has this front desk for president or whoever the commanding officer of the flight is. And this was taking the press and the State Department people over to Libya to photograph Mrs. Secretary Clinton in Libya. And from Libya, we went to Afghanistan and then on to Pakistan, Tajikistan, and it was quite a trip. And the first photo op that I was given the opportunity to take, I was sitting back in the airplane with the Reuters photographer, and he was the pool for the wires, and I was the pool, I guess, for the magazines, but I was there to photograph for Time. Yes, I wasn't a pool, but I was behind the scenes on that trip. They'd agreed for me to go, and I was traveling with our managing editor, Rick Stengel, who was reporting the story. And off we went, and Philippe Rains, who was the press secretary and head of communications for Secretary Clinton, came over to Kevin and myself and said, would you like a picture of the First Lady, I mean, not the First Lady, sorry, the Secretary of State before she takes off? And I said, of course we'd like that, of course. And so we went over and we were both leaning against the wall that was in front of Mrs. Clinton. And she was reading her BlackBerry, and she started rooting around in her pocketbook for her glasses. And she must have realized that she could only find her dark glasses. So she pulled them out of the pocketbook. And I remember saying to Kevin, she's not going to like this picture because she looks so weird in these dark glasses in this dark room reading her BlackBerry. I really, when I sent it to Time, I said, she looks like Dr. No. I mean, this was really kind of a strange picture. And so that was our first picture of her. And certainly it actually, Time considered putting it on the cover and decided that they would run it double truck on the inside as the lead picture instead. And then Mrs. Clinton's people, her wonderful staff, called me up and said, would you mind, Diana, if we used your black and white version of this picture, because Kevin's is in color. You opted to print it in black and white. And I said, yes, the whole take was in black and white, but of course color, I have color available, but I shot it in black and white and meant it to be black and white. And they said, can we use it on Mrs. Clinton's, Facebook page? And I said, of course. So up it went, complete with my byline next to it. And there it rode at the top of her Facebook page until she came out and had a press availability months later at the United Nations in New York. And she came out and she said, yes, I used my iPhone. Yes, I used my private server, and I don't know what's wrong with that. Everybody told me it was all right to do, and why don't you all go away? And all of a sudden, her use of her own BlackBerry became this overinflated, huge story. I'm editorializing a little now. I shouldn't be, but it got blown so out of proportion, and I don't think she handled it well, and I don't think anybody did. And so that picture became this huge this huge picture unexpectedly, because there she was. And so you saw it a lot reproduced in color. And I insisted that we reproduce it only in black and white, because to me that was what I was shooting and why I was shooting. And it was to do a black and white story on her before, for Time. And I basically retired after this shoot, and it was quite a trip to end on. And the picture, using the picture, became quite controversial because it became, South by Southwest. They decided to talk about this picture and its use, and what I was doing and what happened and what it was like and all of that. And so I made a presentation along with the picture editor and art director of Time, and the people from Tumblr who used it in their meme. And their meme went viral. And so this picture went all around the world, Lord knows how many times.
Sure.
I had a real bone to pick with the meme people, with Tumblr, because first of all, they didn't ask my permission. You can see how naive I was about the internet. And I kept thinking it was just like everything else, and that they had to get my permission and they had to get all of it to use the picture. Well, no, that doesn't happen on the internet. Never has and never will, I presume. And I was mad as I could be that Kevin wasn't given a credit for
Right.
his color picture, and I wasn't given credit for my black and white picture, both of which they used in the meme time after time after time. And so
Right.
they said, we didn't know we were supposed to credit you. So I said, well, you are. So I got both of our names put up with our pictures, and I considered that my victory. And anyway, it was fun to take such a controversial picture.
I think it's interesting that you were worried a little bit that she wouldn't like it, but the opposite was true. That actually, her and her staff must have really loved the picture up to a certain point.
They
So it
did.
became an issue.
So, yes, and it was so interesting to me that they liked it, because people's response to this picture, I didn't think she'd like it because she kind of looked funny in the dark. I mean, wearing dark glasses. That's what I meant when I said that to Kevin, that she wouldn't like it for that reason. Not that that mattered to me, but I certainly commented on it. And it was, I heard from everybody else, oh no, she looks so cool, Diana. Young people love this picture because she really looks like a rock star. And that's what it was that was so appealing about this image.
Right.
And shows you what I know. I just
Oh.
take pictures,
Well, here's another one of Steve.
I put this in because I thought you'd like to see him with his wife,
Uh-huh.
who he wasn't that photographed with. She's wonderful. Her name is Laureen Jobs, and he had met her when he made that famous speech at Stanford. She was sitting in the first row, and he went down off the stage and walked right up to her and introduced himself to her after his speech. And they were married, and this is in their garden and
Nice.
their house in Palo Alto.
That's a nice moment, Diana.
Oh, they were.
Oh, I was here for this one. This is Camp David.
Yes.
It actually says Camp David in the background.
Does it? Well, I thought you ought to have something of the world leaders together, and this amused me always. This was out at Camp David, and we hardly ever got photo ops at Camp David. But the Bush people had decided that the president loved driving these golf carts around, and they would have the president drive Gorbachev to his cabin.
Right,
And
right.
that's what's happening here in this picture. Gorbachev has just arrived at Camp David.
That's a great moment. So this is the Clintons last week in the White House. We talked about that before.
Actually, this isn't.
It's not?
No, it's Inauguration Day,
Oh,
January 20th, 1996, 1997. And this is really something. This picture, I was waiting downstairs. I had gotten the Clintons to say that I could photograph behind the scenes on Inauguration Day. And so I was behind the scenes on the state floor of the White House, what they call it. And this agent is in the background. You see him talking into his
sure.
hand. And what he's saying is, who the hell is that woman with a camera on the state floor? Is she supposed to be here? Looking right at me. He was just about to evict me. And down the stairs came Mrs. Clinton and Chelsea. And it was such a funny moment. And this picture doesn't need a caption for a woman. Mrs. Clinton asked Chelsea to show her what she was wearing, And Chelsea opens her coat, and there she has on this mini skirt. And there you see Mrs. Clinton's reaction. And you
It's
see it all in her legs.
it's so hilarious, and the agent and the bust and the cameraman and the Kennedy portrait, they all come into play. It's just a beautiful moment. You really,
It's
you know,
fun.
it's like it's you could write an essay about this one image. I mean, it's and once again, it's making that connection between uh, our leaders in the White House, and any mother and any daughter, like you said, knows what's going on here.
That's right.
So this is the house that Steve Jobs actually did live in without the furniture? If
No, he didn't.
no?
He never lived in this. This was
Okay.
the first time I photographed him. Um, and this was in the living room. I walked in, and I didn't know if I'd ever see the man again. And I had photographed him at Stanford that night um, while he spoke to the students, and it was really kind of a lousy photo op, but it was all I had, and it was a cold flash bounced on the ceiling, and him talking to these kids. And he said, well, what do you want to photograph now? And I said, well, anything. If I could photograph you at home, if I could photograph you tomorrow at the office, I'm here to photograph you as much as I can for this issue of time that is on the machine. I couldn't tell him this, and I didn't tell him, but he knew it was an important story on computers, not on him he exclusively, which it had been the year before when he was Man of the Year.
Oh,
So he,
this is the computer of the year issue?
yes,
Okay.
that's right. And it was the
Right.
computer of the year,
Right.
the machine of the year. And so he said, well, here's the living room. Can you photograph here? And I said, well, why not? So I turned on the Tiffany lamp. He put down the little carpet and got a cup of coffee and had some magazines and sat down on the floor. And I went back. Well, I think I had a 50, maybe 35. And I just, again, I took a reading this time and got the light and opened up as far as I could, and and had the slowest shutter speed I could, hand holding my Leica, and shot some pictures. And it turned out that this picture was such an unusual picture of this, I guess I should call Steve a genius, and because he was. And I had to make do with this picture, which of course now has become sort of symbolic of him,
Yeah.
and has been over the years very much in demand.
No, it's a
He was terrific, and uh, gave me wonderful access from the time I first photographed him, which was here um, in 1981, I guess,
wow.
about right through 2005, I guess, when
Wow.
his health went, and time. We knew when the last time I didn't want to photograph him after I did, and time said, well, we don't want to either. We respect his privacy, and we won't be photographing him again unless he comes out into the public eye, which he did
Sure.
one more time, and I did not go out to photograph that. Somebody else did it with a long lens. And he died too young. That was just about it.
This is a nice moment. Another
Um,
nice moment.
this is again behind the scenes where I'd ask the Careys if I could be with them in the front of the plane that they chartered during the 2004 election. I don't remember where they were going from. And I have to say that my access to them came from friendship. It didn't come from longevity or my professional job. It came really from them. And I had known both of them for a very long time. And
Sure.
he came back to talk to Teresa, and he went over and sat behind her and looked at the newspaper for a bit, and all of a sudden I realized he'd fallen asleep. And I said, this is really behind the scenes. This is what behind the scenes can be if you get lucky.
Yeah.
And this was you can't get anything more sort of intimate than that.
No, you sure can't.
No.
And you keep calling it luck, Diana, but I don't think it is. I think it has to do with the person behind the camera as well. This is another nice moment.
This was a series of pictures. I was with the Clintons on a trip to Africa, and the reason I did this trip for time, was the Monica Lewinsky case had broken in January, and this was in April, and they went together on a trip to Africa, and they were not averse to my being behind the scenes. And I was with them on a boat in the Chobe River in Botswana, and there was just the president's photographer, Bob McNeely, and myself there. And in this case, I had walked away from them and walked to the other side of this sort of large ferry boat kind of boat we were on. And the press was on an entirely different boat. And so I went way away, and I was talking to her, Mrs. Clinton's press secretary, and all of a sudden, Bob was down in front of them taking pictures, and all of a sudden, I looked over, and the president had taken the First Lady's hand and put it against her cheek, and I couldn't believe my eyes. And I took my 80 to 200 zoom, and I held as tight as I could with 400 film, hoping, God, I didn't have any emotion in it. And there was this series of pictures of him taking her, and then he takes his hand and rubs it through her hair, and he did 3 or 4 incredibly touching moments. And I have to tell you, the rest of that trip publicly was not very affectionate. Mrs. Clinton looked mighty angry to me. She really did. And I thought she looked distant, and the other pictures in the trip, it was a long trip, you can really get a feeling of near estrangement.
Sure. This is another. You made a lot of famous pictures, Diana.
There was George Bush when he went to see the troops in Kuwait on Thanksgiving before Desert Storm, and the day was ending. He was out with the army out in the desert, and the sun was going, and I knew I did not have a picture that was going to be good enough to show this president speaking to these boys who were going to war, and they suspected they were, but they didn't know it, and the world didn't know it, and no one knew when. And we were out there, and I was the pool, and actually they took all 3 magazines in the pool. And I had my monopod on, and I had color negative film, because slide film wasn't going to do there. It wasn't going to look good enough. The color itself wouldn't. And the sun was going down, and I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do for a picture here? One of the smart press guys went over to the president, who was standing on a riser out there, and there were all these congressmen standing around him in our way, and they were all up next to him. And this smart young press guy said, "Excuse me, sirs, but if you could please get off the riser so that the press can see the president, that would be just great." And so away went Bob Foley. You can see him down
I see him in the corner, yeah.
All of them got away and left the president there. And all of a sudden, the president reached in his pocket and he pulled out souvenirs for the troops. Who would have known? And he had keychains and tie clips with
presidential seal, yeah.
Started throwing them to the soldiers, and he looked like Moses parting the water. I mean, It was the most amazing picture of strength and calling to action you've ever seen. But I said to New York, you be sure and put a caption on this picture that tells you what he's doing, because we can't misrepresent this. He is not calling the troops to war. He is throwing souvenirs to soldiers. And it won first prize in World Press for news.
Oh, good for you. That's a nice moment. It's a nice moment.
Yeah.
No, here's whose library is this at?
Oh, this is at Nixon's library.
Nixon's library.
I love this picture because American Photographer, which was a magazine back then, picked it up and ran it the week after we had it in the magazine, and they said, this is an interesting presidential picture. The presidents look like the statues that they're of themselves here. And I think they do. I mean, you look at Gerald Ford, and don't you think he looks like kind of a football player, a very nice football player? And George Bush looks a little uncomfortable, which, he could be. And who's next? I can't see.
Well, you got Nixon there in a traditional Nixon pose. It looks like he's dripping sweat right now. And then you got Ronald Reagan ready for the Hollywood marquee. It's like you've got a distinct personality, and then there's
and there they all are. They're
so good.
You see Adenauer and Stalin and Churchill and de Gaulle. These were all the leaders that Nixon said that he'd met with. And this picture was just a picture that was offered to us. And I don't think many people in the press corps even shot it, because it was sort of unimportant. They wanted a picture of the 4 of them much closer together.
Right. Oh, what a gift.
Thrilled with this picture.
Oh, so good.
And I had them all sign it. I put this.
That's nice.
There's a picture that never saw the light of day. It was Al Gore on the campaign trail in an office.
Is this 87 or is this?
This is 2000. When
okay.
Gore was denied the nomination. I mean the.
Right. Okay. So.
And this is with Teddy Kennedy and
Sure.
one of Gore's right hands. And I don't know, I just put it in because they're having so much fun. backstage, you know, these guys are human. They're very, they're very like you and me. They are not different, except they're all very smart usually, and they all want to be president.
Yeah.
And I thought this was fun with Teddy Kennedy looking, you know, particularly amused.
Yeah. Nice. Okay. That's
Uh,
wonderful, Diana. Okay, we're back.
yeah.
That's just a wonderful group of images, and I know the work and the time and the effort, and just, I mean, it's an amazing body of work you have there, and I'm just, thank you so much for sharing that and sharing your knowledge and your stories as well.
Well, one thing I haven't talked about is you and you're coming to Washington. And when I remember seeing you and being so excited to meet you, and our Time editors had all said, we're sending Ken Jarecke down, and you know, he's this and he's that and he's the other. And it was exciting for us to have somebody of your what do you call it, your skills and your what do you call it, reputation, thank you, Diana, of your skill and reputation, come down and join our sort of merry band of people who did this strange thing. These people who followed the President of the United States from one rope line to another, from one motorcade to another, from one bleacher to another, and had these great restrictions. And we were so thrilled that you came down and wanted to do it with us, because nobody else did. It was very restrictive. And I remember how great it was to meet you. And I had this picture ran, I believe, in the magazine that you had taken of from New Jersey, from the New Jersey side of Manhattan, of the Twin Towers. You remember that picture?
Yeah.
Yes, you do. And I have it on my wall at home, and I am so thrilled to own it. I can't tell you. And everybody asks me, and I say, well, this is Ken Jarecke. And they say, oh, we've heard of him. And I say, yeah, of course you've heard of him. And I said, you can't believe how lucky I am. I've met him again in Montana, where we go, where we have a place out there. And it's sort of like you got to meet him when you were all running around, pushing and shoving, and what a lovely guy he is. And now you get to meet him later, he and Suad, his gorgeous wife. And it's like just such a thrill for me. It really is. And it's really nice to talk to you, because I know you know what this work is or what it's about. And it's very nice of you to be so respectful of it, but it is a difficult and different kind of work. And it was really nice to have you along.
Well, it's so kind and generous for you to say that, Diana, and it means a tremendous it's to come from you to say that, and because you're always my hero. I always looked up to you. I always took my cues from people like you that knew how to work in Washington, D.C. And I was an outsider. I was an outsider, and I was just grateful to like get into Wire 2 now and then and go along for the ride. So thank you for that, and thank you for sharing, because your stories are so important, and it's just so important.
Well, good. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
I'll see you soon. Much love. Say hi to everybody for me.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.